have a good stack of attendees joining us now. So I am going to go ahead and I want to welcome everybody. Thank you to all the panelists for joining us and those of you in the audience as well. This was very short notice, but I thought very important to have this conversation early on, excuse me, at the tail end of the convoy. I'm Dr. Britt Perry. I'm the director of the Center on Hate, Bias, and Extremism here at Ontario Tech. So just want to welcome you here and acknowledge that the land on which Ontario Tech University operates has for thousands of years been the traditional land of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island, a branch of the Greater Anishinaabe Nation, which includes Algonquin, Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. While we're grateful to be working on these lands, we as settlers are by definition an uninvited presence, legitimated only through force and coercion applied by colonial forces of the past and present. Although we're all governed by Williams treaties, we recognize the imbalance of power inherent in these treaties. Thus, we're committed to building partnerships that frame our presence by substantially changing the foundation of our relationship in accordance with the desires of First Nation people. I would also like at the outset to encourage us all to send our thoughts to the Ukraine, of course, who right now know what a threat to freedom and to life really looks like. In contrast to what we've seen over the last 3 weeks. I think that it really puts it into perspective for many of us. I don't want to spend a lot of time myself at the beginning. I really want to get to our panelists. I've heard or read each of your comments and your thoughts on what we've been seeing over the past few weeks. So I really want to get to the meat of the matter very quickly. But as I was sort of thinking about this event today, one of the places I went to was sort of thinking about the sorts of questions that journalists had been asking many of us as we were watching the convoy unfold and the occupation build. And so you're probably all familiar, nod, you've heard these questions, right? Did this movement emerge suddenly? What are the links between the movement and right-wing extremists? What did the signs, the flags, the symbols that we saw represent? Was there foreign influence involved here? What role has disinformation played in engendering the movement and helping it to build? What are the implications for democracy and for trust in our core institutions, including the media, the state generally, and I think law enforcement in particular? And what do we make of the law enforcement response here? So I think that we're going to hear some thoughts and some responses to those sorts of questions. One of the things in response to that first question in particular, did this movement emerge suddenly? I've often, my response flippantly often starts with, I hate to say I told you so, but I think many of us here today have probably said, I told you so. Or as one of my colleagues here says, I told you this would happen. I think, Shad, you're in the audience, so that's our line. As we all know, this really extends the trajectory of what we've been seeing in terms of the rise of the far right since at least 2015, 2016, and in particular with respect to the anti-authority and anti-statist element in the Canadian context, something that we've been seeing more recently, especially in the context of COVID. The anti-authority movement, the sovereign citizens, the freemen, were almost a dying breed, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, when with my colleagues Ryan Scrivens and David Hoffman, we published a report on the anti-authority movement. This has given them, I think, a new life, sadly. We know that right-wing extremism was, sort of embedded in the movement from the get-go. It wasn't just something that they picked up as they went along, although they certainly did that as well as that slow-moving snowball moved its way across the country. It picked up all sorts of flotsam and jetsam, including some, people with some authentic concerns, but also a lot of very opportunistic activists within the far right, whether affiliated with groups or independent of that. So I'm really looking forward to what all of you have to say and the additional insights that you will add to this conversation. One last thing that I do want to share before I turn it over to the speakers is a tweet that was recently posted by Bob Ray. And I think it really encapsulates much of what our criticisms are of the convoy and the movement associated with it. He said, "A truck is not speech. A horn is not a voice. An occupation is not a protest. A blockade is not freedom, as it blocks the liberty of all. A demand to overthrow government is not a dialogue. The expression of hatred is not a difference of opinion. A lie is not the truth." And I think it really does sum up very nicely some of the comments that I've heard many of my colleagues make over the past few weeks. So we'll turn it over now to the speakers, and I'm not going to read their bios. Their bios are available to you on our website under the events for CHBE. Brad, if you want to put that link in the chat, I appreciate it. But we're going to lead off with our friend and colleague Amarasingam, I always get that wrong, who's an assistant professor in the School of Religion with cross appointment in the Department of Political Studies at Queen's University. So Amar, the stage is yours.
Sure. Yeah, thanks for having me. It's good to kind of be at an event like this where we can retrospectively think about what we saw. I mean, I think what we saw initially, in its entirety was nothing like we've seen in the recent past in Canadian political history. It was really a kind of energized movement that I think has to be separated from some of the organizers, right? And I think we need to kind of analytically at least look at the organizers as quite separate from the everyday people that showed up. And the organizers were people we've known for some time. They were, openly anti-Semitic, they're openly white nationalist, they're openly conspiratorial. Many have active links with far-right groups like the Diagolon Network, etc. And they've also tried to organize convoys before, as many of us have said to journalists over the last little while. In 2019, they tried to organize one called United We Roll, which kind of just fluttered out without much consequence. But it's very much the same network that was involved this time. As for the regular people who I think have struggled throughout the pandemic, there is a legitimate, I would say, grievance there. Canada is just now coming out of its fourth lockdown. We still have mask mandates. We still have to show our vaccine passports to get into restaurants. There's been enormous impact on small businesses, school shutdowns, the mental health of our children, and so on. And over the last 2 years of the pandemic, we saw basically a rise not only in COVID conspiracy theories, but with different organizations and different groups and networks basically latch on to the COVID misinformation and COVID conspiracy theories to kind of skyrocket their own brands, right? And so in one of the chapters that we wrote for the stress tested edited book, we have a nice little chart that shows a kind of sudden burst of QAnon activity in Canada and abroad, starting exactly in March 2020 when the COVID conspiracies took off, right? So a lot of these disparate movements, I think, were able to come together thanks to COVID and thanks to the COVID conspiracy theories and really hitch their wagon to the kind of pandemic infodemic star, if you will. They were able to kind of say, we told you so, the Trudeau government was corrupt, we told you were being lied to. And 3 years into the pandemic, some people, the message kind of resonated a bit more with some people, unfortunately. And so COVID really brought a lot of these disparate movements together under a common cause. Surprisingly, some are pro-vaccine but anti-mandate, right? And so there is kind of nuances within these individuals that show up at these kinds of protests. But one thing that was quite interesting about these people is they were able to raise money very quickly. They were able to get people to actually leave their house and drive across the country in the dead of Canadian winter, which is no small feat in and of itself. But it was clear from the beginning, because of the flags they were carrying, because of the rhetoric of the organizers, that they weren't going to really have much success in terms of actual political interests, right? Aside from some politicians on the conservative right in Canada who did express support, did go to the rallies, did shake their hands, et cetera. It was never going to, I think, gain that level of mainstream support, because Trudeau is not going to come talk to people who are holding "Hang Trudeau" signs, right? It's kind of not politically feasible to do those kinds of things, and so it was going to come to a point where it was going to be a policing situation in some form or another. From a policing perspective, I think there were several failures. I think, as I've said before, I think cops, the Ottawa police in particular, really treated this like a January 6th moment for Canada. So they protected their MPs. You know, I have friends who are members of Parliament who received emails and texts basically asking them to stay indoors. They protected MPs, they protected the Parliament buildings. But I think the idea that a bunch of trucks were going to pull up into Ottawa and park there indefinitely, have cookouts and dance parties, was not part of the policing calculus, really. And so they basically lost the streets to the trucks, and it became a long-term problem, right? And then you had failures at every level of government. The municipal level basically decided, you know, it's an election year, the mayor's not running again. We're not going to deal with it. Doug Ford didn't want to deal with it because maybe he felt like some people at this protest were part of his base to begin with. Trudeau didn't want to engage with it for the reasons I spoke about. And so you had different levels of government just kind of pass the buck to each other, and nothing actually happened. And so I'll kind of stop there because I don't know how much we want to talk later, but just as an introduction, I think, you know, it's something we've never seen before in Canada, this level of kind of mobilization, and it's not going to go away now that the trucks have left. And so it'll be with us for some time, I think.
Yeah, sadly, I think you're right, Amara. It's not going away anytime soon. I think we all expected to see the trucks come back in the weekend immediately following, the clearance of downtown Ottawa. But we have seen smaller protests and rallies, if you will, scattered across the country still. So, I think waiting to pick up speed. As many people have said, we're all done with COVID, but COVID's not done with us. So, I think we fully expect, by the end of April, probably maybe we'll have some of those restrictions back in place, and then there we go again. But thanks for those opening comments. Really helpful. I think really helped situate it nicely, Amar. I'm going to turn now to our colleague Carolyn Orr Bueno, who's a postdoc research associate at the University of Maryland, and I think interesting to get sort of the American perspective on what we've been experiencing here, but also I think some more insight into the things that Amar was referring to in terms of conspiracy theories and disinformation. So, Carolyn, thank you so much for joining us. Look forward to hearing you.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and thank you everybody for coming today. So just a real brief background on why there is an American here commenting on Canadian events. I've been covering far right and misinformation, disinformation in Canada now since about 2016. And more recently in 2019, I helped lead the National Observer's Election Integrity Reporting Project, and I was focused on disinformation. So that is mostly what I'm going to be talking about today, and there is certainly plenty of it. I'm also going to hit a little bit on some of the media coverage, which included a fair bit of misinformation itself, the mainstream media coverage. This was an event that kicked off with misinformation. Some of the first viral posts about the convoy were about the size of it, and some really ridiculous estimates on how many thousands of truckers there were. Those eventually got fact checked, but by that time they had already gone viral, and really there was never a conclusion among most of the public. I mean, there are figures out there that seem pretty solid at this point, but there are still many people who have no idea how large this was, how many trucks were participating. It looks like there were probably about 120 at the time this went viral. Just that's what most of the reporting indicates at this point. So that kind of set the mood, I think, for the rest of this, kicking off with these really extravagant claims and kind of undermining the idea of a shared reality and being able to agree on some basic facts, even on how many people are participating and really what is this about? That's another thing that there's still a lot of confusion about. There's very disparate narratives about the convoy and why all of these people went to Ottawa and what they were doing and what they wanted and what their true motivation was. There are some who say, it was about vaccines, and if they had just undone the mandate, they would have all been gone. I think probably most of us here take issue with that perspective because of the history of the people involved in the convoy and the fact that they have kind of done similar things, but with other issues before, like oil and gas. In terms of where this misinformation was coming from, social media obviously was a primary vector. Facebook, Twitter, Telegram were three of the big platforms. On Facebook, there was what I would describe as an astroturfing campaign, which is basically where accounts are created to give the impression of a grassroots movement, to make it look like these are just a bunch of regular Canadians getting together to organize a protest, and to sort of hide any involvement of organized groups or well-funded groups. And there were also discovered to be some hacked accounts promoting the convoy, as well as some accounts in several countries outside of Canada, not including the US, although that was certainly part of it as well. So there was, what we described as synthetic or inauthentic amplification of this event. However, I think it's important to acknowledge too, there was also a lot of legitimate support, particularly among far-right voters, that there was legitimate support. This was not a movement that was totally foreign or totally inauthentic. However, the point of artificial amplification and these sort of astroturfing and other forms of platform manipulation is to influence everyday people, and is to make it look like it's a bigger movement and like there's more support for it, so that regular people do become involved. So there's kind of always a question of, well, if that wasn't there, how much of the actual support would have been there? And that's a question that I'm not sure that we can answer at this point. In addition to social media, we also saw a fair bit of mis and disinformation in mainstream media coverage, particularly from the United States. Fox News covered the convoy extensively. Interestingly, though, and this is just a side note that I find fascinating, as much as Fox News covered it, there's actually one channel that covered it more, and that was RT, which is Russia's state-sponsored media outlet, and they covered it more than Fox News. They of the sort of main international media outlets, they covered it, RT covered it the most, which is, I think, an interesting data point. We don't know exactly what that means, but it's certainly something that caught my attention, and I think is of interest. Fox News caught on relatively early. They came in late January and started covering this pretty extensively. Their nighttime hosts, particularly like Sean Hannity, Laura Ingraham, Tucker Carlson, they gave oxygen to the convoy. They brought on some of the organizers and people involved with the convoy. They promoted the GoFundMe. When the GoFundMe was taken down, they helped kind of lead that whole campaign against GoFundMe. And they played a role also in setting the stage for the US version of the convoy to the extent that it is happening. Now, we'll see, that's still kind of in motion at the moment. But I think the interesting thing to note about Fox News, there are parallels between their coverage of the convoy and their coverage of January 6th here in the US, in that in a lot of ways, these, the big name hosts almost willed this into reality, particularly when we're talking about the US convoy, because I've been kind of following that around social media since it first started being talked about. And Fox News was already advertising dates and routes that it would take, and publicizing the name of the convoy before it was really widely known. Well, it was still largely relegated to the fringes of social media. Fox News started platforming this, which is interesting. They have obviously a huge audience. All of those nighttime anchors who I just mentioned have, an audience in the millions. So anytime you mention something like that, that is some significant oxygen. And I think, Canada is not really used to being that much in the crosshairs of the Fox News machine. And, given what we know about the so-called Fox effect, I would say that it is highly likely that they did have some impact on, how this played out. We can't probably, there's no way to estimate sort of the specifics on, did Fox News get more people out there? Did they prolong it? But I think they certainly at some key moments energized the organizers and kind of let them know that there was support for them, and that they, as the sort of the Canadian public was starting to turn against them, they almost provided like this new breath of fresh air for them. And I think that was incredibly important. And there is a part of me that wonders, if this would have ended earlier without some of that support from these US media figures. And I'll just say one more thing, and then I'll come back to this later. But I think for me, the biggest takeaway here regarding both the misinformation issue and the media coverage in general is just sort of this loss of a shared reality, and this question now that I think is something that Canadians are going to have to grapple with, is sort of who gets to write the narrative about what happened, because there isn't one narrative. There are very disparate narratives right now, and depending on who gets to write that, they could be quite different. So I think moving forward, that is certainly what is on my mind.
Great, Carolyn. I really appreciate that. Especially thinking about the role that Fox News, of all things, has played in this. But I think also just a reminder that, it wasn't just social media, but the traditional media also played a role in, different directions, perhaps. But nonetheless, we're very much involved in, I think, some of the giving the oxygen is a conversation that I know many of us have probably all had with journalists, is how much oxygen is too much oxygen for these sorts of actors and movements, whether it's small scale or large scale like this. And I think that's a very important one, and maybe something that we can talk about later on. But really appreciate that. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to go across the country, not just across the border, but not across the country, but across the world, and say a very good morning to Josh. Thank you so much for joining us. Our next speaker, Dr. Josh Roose, Senior Research Fellow at the Alfred Deakin Institute for Citizenship and Globalization at Deakin University. And it just so happens Josh and I were on a panel together a week or so ago, and I was really struck by the parallels between what he was sharing about the Australian parallel movement. And so I thought it would be really great to have some insight there, because we are, of course, seeing sort of copycat, or we were seeing copycat protests and convoys in other countries, Australia being one of them, and New Zealand as well. So Josh, again, thank you so much for joining us so early in the morning, and hopefully the caffeine is in your system now. So off you go.
It sure is. Thank you. I have put together a PowerPoint just to give you a visual of the Australian dimension of all this, which I think is actually pretty important. So I'm just going to quickly share screen. All right, just confirming that's up. Okay, can you see that?
Yep.
Yes.
All right. All right. Just before I start, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I'm presenting today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respect to their elders past and present and future, and to acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about what's been happening in the Australian context. We've had a really very active freedom movement, as they call themselves, and most recently a so-called convoy to Canberra, which drew inspiration directly from what was happening in the Canadian context. So not only are the US exporting this sort of material, but obviously the Canadians are too, to some extent. Probably being a bit cheeky in saying that. So I'm going to start by just giving you a few takeaways from what I'm talking about. The groups were initially highly diverse, and I'm going to go into that, but they've consolidated around core narratives. And so we're seeing, I suppose, a tightening of what they're about. And many of these have far-right ideological underpinnings. The protest initially started quite small, but they've become highly politically motivated. And there's a core of about 10 to 20,000 people now, what I call a committed core of activists, even though public health responses and so on have actually really started to loosen over here. There's a really strong transnational dimension to this, and we are heavily influenced over here by development in the US, but more recently Canada. Social media has played a really important role in transmitting those ideas to Australia, but in particular encrypted messaging apps like Telegram, which are increasingly a way of communication that extends when they're banned from social media. And citizen journalism and alt-right media outlets in particular are also playing a role. The last presenter was talking about Fox News, but we get that over here, but we get InfoWars, we get all sorts of different material. And these groups have significant violent potential, I would argue, demonstrated in their vocabulary and symbology, and in some cases acts. But more importantly, I argue they form the base of a potential far-right populist movement over here as well. Just to give a quick bit of background, Australia, I mean, 10 years ago, none of this was on the cards over here, but we've seen the emergence of the Australian far right over the last 6 or 7 years, which coincided, broadly speaking, with the impact of Trump on Australian politics, which made it actually, in some ways, okay to say and provocative statements and to be racist more openly in public discourse. We have the most concentrated media network in the world. Murdoch, basically owns, I think, something like 60 to 80% of Australian media outlets. So we don't get a lot of diversity in our mainstream news. We're seeing growing inequalities, including the housing market. In the last 10 years, housing's doubled from 500,000 to over $1 million in my city. People are increasingly unable to afford housing and the basics. Increasingly precarious work, 20 years of securitisation and the war on terror. And I suppose when all this all came to the fore when the pandemic hit and we saw certain groups marginalised from the workforce, and while some people could work at home during the lockdowns, others couldn't. And so certain communities were more impacted. And we've had the world's longest cumulative period of lockdown anywhere in Melbourne over the last couple of years as well. So in terms of the protests, look, I identify 3 key stages, and they all, I suppose, you've got this live protest occurring, but you've also got live online protests where they're communicating in real time, and we've been able to observe that and to research it. So we're seeing a period when the lockdowns first came in 2020. We saw a period, I suppose, of small anti-vaccination protests, small anti-lockdown freedom movements of several hundred people gathering in shopping centres and so on, often refusing to wear masks. And they were quite marginalised. But by the middle of last year in 2021, this became some quite large protests and actually quite a fair bit of violence. We saw at one point 70 or 80,000 people taking to the streets in Melbourne, and a really broad coalition that I'll go into soon. That died off, that mass element died off, both as the lockdowns ended, but also as people got turned off some of the more extremist messaging that was associated with these groups. But what we saw recently was the Canberra convoy, where there was a movement of 10 to 20,000 people converging on Canberra, seeking to block the streets, also talking about invading or breaking into our parliaments. There was a fire at our old Parliament House. So again, drawing inspiration not only from the Canadian context, but also the January 6th insurrection as well. This is probably, I'd be quite interested because I pay close attention to what's going on in the Canadian context. And there did seem to be quite a lot of diversity, and I think it's important to break that down. I think there are close parallels between Australia and Canada to that extent. There were the so-called mums and dads, people who like to basically say, well, we're just exercising our right to protest. We're not associated with any extremist group. And to some extent, that may well be the case. And people have a democratic right to protest, particularly against vaccine mandates and so on, and what they saw as heavy-handed public health policy. But on the other hand, it was immediately evident that there were strong driving forces from anti-vaccination activists, militant wellness communities, QAnon conspiracy theorists deriving their ideas directly from online and the US, sovereign citizen movements. Really interestingly, we saw evangelical and Orthodox Christians in particular showing up. And that really brought a multicultural dimension to the protests. We saw our Pacific Islander communities, our newer migrant communities from South Asia, for example, many who identify as evangelical Christians. But we also saw a lot of Europeans, of people of European background protesting. And we know that priests and so on were playing a role in that. The far right had a very strong presence from the early days. The Proud Boys, Australia chapter, National Socialists. In the bottom photo, you'll see a few of those. But also European ultranationalists. We saw the Croatian Ustaš flag, for example, being flown quite prominently at these protests. Far right citizen journalists. I know you've got Rebel News over in Canada, but they've also got strong local activists here. Far right populist politicians seeking to sort of capitalise on all this, and it coalesced around common ideas, both libertarian but also with far right underpinnings. And I thought the core narratives might be an interesting comparison with Canada, really just looking basically at what they're against and what they're for. And the language is very similar to what I've seen in North America, this concept of tyranny, being anti-government, anti-elite, being politicians, media, globalists, as they see it, like Bill Gates, inherently anti-science, anti-Semitic, anti-women. There's a lot of misogyny in these forums, anti-LGBTIQ. Again, a lot of really pretty disgusting homophobic language in these contexts, but also anti-communist as they see it. Anyone who's from the left, broadly speaking, is represented as communist. And what they're for, and to what extent do these concepts, these narratives have any real meaning at all? Freedom, truth, choice. A really interesting one is love. And I saw this in the Canadian context. A lot of people saying, well, we're here about love. We're here about choice and truth. And that all sounds pretty reasonable, at least superficially. But also, more ominously, punishment and revenge. We saw talk about hanging traitors and politicians and so on. And in more recent days over here, we've seen a strong pro-Russia sentiment in the context of the Ukrainian invasion that is infiltrating. And I think it's important to get our head around that quite quickly, because I think internationally that's going to be an issue. Just to talk quickly to that violent potential, violent language. You'll see here Ricardo Bossi, who's a former SAS Lieutenant Colonel, who's talked openly about hanging politicians, media, traitors and others. Violent symbols. We see the noose, which I've seen internationally. I've seen it in the Canadian context. I've seen it in Australia quite prominently as well. But also violent acts and plots at the individual level, people seeking to break into politicians' offices, people also, plotting to kidnap politicians and so on. But also the fire at Old Parliament House over here. Broadly speaking, the Australian government security agencies have paid particular attention to this and are aware and are actively looking into prosecuting some of the individuals who've made, quite violent statements. Core themes here are victimhood. Flying the Australian flag upside down is a symbol of distress, and you see that very prominently over here. Politicians and the media should be hung as traitors. Opponents are evil. It's a very binary sort of framing. The execution of politicians, media and elites as a whole, and the need to arm and train. So we've seen small groups here talking about not only obtaining weapons, but taking to the hills, US militia style. And again, that influence coming directly from social media. The freedom movement, in terms of far-right populism, I think it intersects with that extremist dimension, intersects with far-right populism over here, and I'm sure it does over there as well in some capacity. It's driven locally in a local context with local framing, but it mimics and is highly influenced by international figures. We see here Australian politicians being interviewed, by on InfoWars or by Bannon, and commonly being, expressing those ideas in the Australian context, and particularly dangerous when these are hitting our halls of our parliament and becoming mainstream. We know that's occurring in the US. I'm not sure the extent to which that's occurring in the Canadian context, but really, really extreme ideas are actually infiltrating our halls of power. Australian democracy, as robust as it is also fragile. The balance of power in a highly, I suppose, divided society where you vote for one of two major parties, is actually open to capture and being held to the vested interests of key players. So, for example, billionaire Clive Palmer, who really is the Australian Trump, who's invested hundreds of millions of dollars in advertising and basically has a populist right-wing campaign. He's openly anti-vaccine. He's openly anti migration. He's a coal miner. So we're seeing these fringe players actually becoming quite prominent and potentially powerful in Australia. And there's also efforts to build a constituency by these groups like the United Australia Party and fringe right-wing politicians who are openly attending these protests and seeking to engage the individuals. So I'm just repeating my takeaways there, but I hope what I've done is being able to bring an international comparison to what I think is a really important global problem now.
Thank you, Josh. I appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, the parallels are really striking and be interesting to look. I think, our histories are so similar between Canada and Australia. Perhaps no surprise there, but it would be interesting to have, to bring in, a third and a fourth perspective. What are we seeing in Germany, for example? What are we seeing in a couple of other countries, and whether those parallels remain? I think in the Canadian context, it's the trajectory of the far right is shorter, I think, than a lot of European countries in particular, but I think very similar to the Australian case. So really appreciate you highlighting that. Okay, well, we're going to conclude here by turning the floor over to Dr. Michael Kempa, who's Associate Professor of Criminology at University of Ottawa. And I think, like me, many of you have probably watched him on CBC as events unfolded in Ottawa, and was continually impressed with your poise and aplomb through all of that. And I think, I wanted to sort of wrap up with you, because one of the things that I'd like to hear, among others, is, some attention to the way that law enforcement mismanaged, didn't manage the occupation. So thank you very much, Michael, you are next.
Thank you. I think one of the things with all of us having been teaching online for many months, that's where you develop some poise for talking now in media, because we're constantly talking into these cameras and have all developed decent broadcasting skills by doing that. So I have come at this through the window of policing, first through policing COVID, and through COVID, obviously, it now blending in and combining with far-right issues and issues of mass protest. There are going to be a number of inquiries into what went wrong with the policing system right across Canada. The big one, of course, coming from the Emergencies Act itself, the mandated inquiry into all the causes that led to the conventional system breaking down, which necessitated the Emergencies Act to begin with. There will be a number of inquiries also, or commissions looking into policing in Ottawa specifically. So the Ontario Civilian Police Commission has been asked by City Council here to look into policing specifically, and the Police Services Board, the civilian oversight body in Ottawa, has also asked for an independent look into issues that may go a little bit beyond the public police service, to include municipal government and civilian oversight and some of its potential role that contributed to policing's failures in the massive convoy protest. So I've come at this from a little bit of coming from the literature to inform some hypotheses to share with some of these inquiries to help guide what they're up to, but then also myself looking at the detail of what went wrong to go in the other direction, to go back to the academic literature to try to make a contribution to understanding policing systems failure and policing bias and so forth in the other direction. I do have a PowerPoint, but I'm only going to share a couple of the slides because there's more information. I really got going on it yesterday in terms of detail, because I always find it so important to build a timeline of events whenever I'm looking at something in detail. And there were so many events in that short period of time that we couldn't possibly go through them right now. The thing to say, though, is there seems to have been the theme of not ample, but adequate warning to policing agencies that the convoy approaching different locations did not have good intentions. There was a clear intention to set up camp and render the city of Ottawa at least ungovernable, and not leave until political demands were met prior to the arrival in Ottawa, such that the police in Ottawa seem to have completely underestimated the threat of what they literally saw, not figuratively, but literally saw approaching down the highway over a period of nearly a week. From there, we went through a pattern of, first of all, explosion of protest size on the weekends, where what we started calling the leisure hours protesters would arrive, the families and the citizen journalists and so forth that Josh so ably described in Australia, and then the hardcore business hours protesters that were there for the week, that were camped down in their trucks and had no intentions of leaving. And the huge swing in numbers, such that you were dealing with as many as 8,000 to 12,000 on weekends and as few as 200 to 500, depending on whose counts you believe, on Monday and Tuesday mornings. So it became very hard to understand for people in and around Ottawa why there wasn't a more active policing response in the business hours on Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday mornings, when the numbers were small enough that police would not have been swarmed or overwhelmed, and all of the things that police were citing as reasons not to intervene in weekend times. So ample warning or an adequate warning, that pattern of swelling and contraction for business hours and leisure hours of protest. And then the third thing coming on that being escalating protest tactics combined with escalating legal declarations at the level of the municipality declaring an emergency first, followed by the province a few days later, and then finally the federal government on the 14th of February, still combined with very little police activity up until the thing being nearly 3 weeks along. So trying to understand that total systems breakdown there's obviously a lot to untangle, but if you start in a sort of immediate sense, there was an obvious lack of ability to recognize the threat approaching, as I said, which led into questions of whether or not there had been adequate planning at all for these types of events in Ottawa as foreseen problems, but also as the problem that was seen coming in a literal sense for about a week. There was evidently a high degree of confusion about division of responsibility between police command and the civilian oversight body, the Police Services Board. We know that because immediately after the federal government declared the emergency on 14th February, the chief of police, Peter Slowly, resigned on the 15th February. And the stories that were leaked had to do with the chief having ignored advice from upper level command of the police, of having basically browbeaten his own staff, shut people out who had good advice to give and so forth, which led to the obvious question of, was this the first time the Police Services Board had been hearing about an alleged problematic management style on the part of Peter Slowly? That would be surprising, and that would suggest that perhaps the board was not asking the right questions in the lead up to the protest itself. Now, there has been a high degree of confusion. Boards have tended to assume that they have absolutely no role in police operations. This is not accurate. It's very clear that boards have a responsibility to hold chiefs operationally responsible on these issues, which means asking proactive questions about the adequacy of planning, but then asking follow-up questions as well as to why particular strategies have been selected to the exclusion of others. Now, in the end, the chief does have the final say, but that doesn't mean that there's no role for boards in this respect. So we're not quite sure whether or not the police services boards asked any or all of these questions, but we do know that the day after the chief was resigned or did resign, the chair of the Police Services Board was ousted by City Council on the 15th of February. So I would just highlight, this is an extraordinarily unusual thing for a municipal government to do so close to the end of a term of council, with an election coming up in Ottawa in October of this year. So the statement from the City Council was that they had lost confidence in the chair of the Police Services Board. As I say, it's extraordinary, and these will be things to look into in the inevitable inquiries, or the inquiries that are actually coming, not inevitable. Some hypotheses for why police management, and it would be unfair to say that Peter Slowly would have been uniquely responsible for this, may have underestimated the approaching threat of the convoy. There's a long history from the literature of police organizations underestimating the threat posed by far-right political movements, by white nationalist movements, and responding in a less than enthusiastic fashion to protests coming from that area. Some of the hypotheses that come up around that, and partially from my impressionistic dealings with just chatting with police officers that I knew on the ground in Ottawa there was a lot of resentment amongst police officers for having been put in what they saw as a very difficult structural position by what they perceived as political mismanagement of the COVID-19 question generally. So they basically said, well, look, this is a government problem. They've managed COVID-19 terribly. Whether they believed in vaccination mandates or not, it hasn't been communicated properly. We are now in a situation where there's 8,000 to 12,000 people in the street and 1,200 of us So what do they expect us to do to manage this political problem? Is very dangerous for us, and we actively resent it. So we're likely to, stand back a little bit and not really put ourselves into harm's way all that much. Certainly within police organizations, there is a degree of sympathy for the anti-vaccination movement. We shouldn't be surprised by that, because the police in many ways are an exaggerated reflection of society's attitudes. So if we have people in society who have anti-vaccine mandate perspectives, we will of course also find that in police services, and everybody has seen the footage of certain YouTube videos of police officers welcoming protesters, embracing them in some cases. Again, the end there is small, the number is small, but we know it's there. We need to find out what degree of sympathy for that movement there is in police organizations. And then finally, and I suspect the number here will be very small, but again, since police reflect society's attitudes, there will be a degree of sympathy for radical conservative politics within police organizations. We simply need to find out more about what the N here is and whether or not that N is large enough to have impacted police responses at all. If it's very small, it wouldn't have impacted what the police did on the ground. If it's larger, it could actually have been a contributing factor. And one of the things that brings us concern there is we do have a number of former police and military among the ranks of the convoy organizers and involved in their so-called security team that did their logistical planning and execution in the city of Ottawa and elsewhere. And finally, questions of breakdown in confidence amongst officers in police command, whether that was due to a failure of leadership, and that will come out when we look into exactly whether or not these allegations about Peter Slowly were accurate. I suspect many of them were exaggerated at minimum, or a rejection of his leadership. There was several years of troublesome rank and file engagement with Slowly's agenda to address systemic racism within the Ottawa police, very racist tropes circulated about the chief and so forth, that may have been a contributing factor. So going in the other direction, providing some hypotheses to inquiries and then saying, well, if I was to now begin to pursue more data to inform the theories that come at explaining police behavior and police systems breakdown in many cases, most of the literature tends to tie policing to politics, economy, and culture in terms of either conceptual or structural type analyses, where ways of thinking about politics and economy are reflected in police organizations. So for example, shifts from welfare liberalism to neoliberalism being reflected in policing programs, a shift from expert service delivery to diffuse community models and so forth, or structural issues where the imperatives of the capitalist system or the white supremacist system or the patriarchal system compel the police to enforce certain laws in certain ways, whether or not they have honorable or dishonorable intentions. And these are certainly all very valuable, but in keeping with the idea that there were many layers to this protest, different types of protesters, it was apparent, and I think will come out in the wash of data, that there are also many layers of policing agents that were on the ground with this particular set of initiatives. So we often talk about the police or the OPP or the RCMP, and certainly my impression over the years has been that there is no RCMP. There are many RCMPs, in that there's fiefdoms of RCMP organization that have very different cultures that are pursuing very different sets of aims. Similarly, we're likely to find that there are clusters of police officers that were and were not acting well for a variety of reasons. And many of these go into the area of what I would call dark politics. So where their politics either anti-vax mandate, sympathy for far-right political movements, or partisan jockeying or jockeying for electoral advantage around the policing governance model, the police services board, and certain members acting in certain ways with respect to policing with potentially their own political ambitions at heart, are very, very important. And these are issues that have had less attention in the literature. Now, a lot of this has to do with doing that type of detailed analysis is extraordinarily difficult and requires a high degree of participant observation, almost to the end of like ethnographic type work. And we all know that this has fallen off in the university, mostly for the reason that it's almost impossible to have this type of project approved through ethics review processes. I mean, doing interviews with police officers involves an extraordinarily lengthy ethics review process. Doing a ride along is almost impossible these days for issues of liability and so forth. But an actual ethnography that was to go into examining the connections between police organizations and dark political processes and police services boards and their connection and other oversight bodies and their connection to electoral politics would be almost impossible. And it's here that I'd say there's a real opportunity for either teamwork or blending in with investigative journalism type work, where many I-teams are doing this type of embedded analysis. I would say that I have also done some of it myself, like not as an academic, gathered the data as a investigative journalist type process. And then once I've published in the media on those questions, then taking that data to ethics review at the university for secondary use purposes, because then it's already a matter of public domain. So you're going to get a very easy ethics process approval for using that type of data for secondary purposes for an academic type project. So I did say I had slides. I didn't put any of them up because I just got going on a roll there. But that's the gist of it. This notion of developing an academic study of the dark politics of policing in terms of its detail is a major priority for myself.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, I mean, that's one of the areas, I think, both in terms of the military and law enforcement and their, their sort of nexus with far-right extremism is such an important issue right now. And, I found actually the military to be far more open to that kind of research, obviously, than law enforcement. It's also more centralized, so it's a little easier in that respect. But even this, the very question of right-wing extremism, never mind within their ranks, is, a touchy point for law enforcement very often. So the challenge is, but you're absolutely right about REB. We have stories. We have stories.
Oh, absolutely. Very few people are doing any kind of situated analysis with police organizations, mostly for that reason.
Yeah. So we'll be watching you for that. We've heard it here. You're on record. So many questions to ask here. Oh my gosh, I can't thank you all enough for what you've contributed here. I will turn it over to the attendees, but first I want to ask if anyone has any comments, because really what we've been talking about here has been the occupation of Ottawa. But I wonder what observations you might have on things that we were seeing in other parts of the country, the blockades, border blockades that we were seeing out west, and the convoys that we have hardly talked about down on the East Coast. So does anyone have maybe Amar in particular thoughts on that? And Michael, even you, especially in terms of policing and this parallel that's drawn, or not parallel, but the lack of parallel in terms of how indigenous protests might be responded to if they were blocking the border relative to what we've seen here. So I open it to anyone, but I think that the two of you maybe have the most insight here.
Yeah, I mean, I would add, kind of racial bias probably to the list of things that Michael Kempa talked about. I just can't imagine another group of people of color, Black Canadians, Brown Canadians, Muslim Canadians, who for weeks were calling for the dissolution of the government, then organized a kind of mass migration to Ottawa, entrenched themselves in the city for 3 weeks, had block parties and set up stages upon which they were showing movies and music videos, cooking in public, blocked 2 major US border crossings in Windsor and Detroit, drove around the Ottawa airport talking about harassing the Ottawa airport, and then and this is all before the Coots, the Coots border arrests of mass weapons and so on, being treated in the same way. I just can't imagine it. Maybe I'm crazy, but I think that level of racial bias, and I totally agree with Michael in the sense that there are kind of cohorts within the police forces who are probably more sympathetic than other cohorts. But I think overall, it would be interesting to get a sense of how kind of implicit racial bias plays out when you're talking about Indigenous protests, BLM protests. There are a lot of comparisons being made on Twitter, for example, between the clearing of the homeless encampment in Toronto, which was hugely violent and unnecessarily violent compared to what happened in Ottawa. So those things I think are things to think about and questions that will remain with us also.
Yeah, if I could jump on that, absolutely. I think that in terms of the failure to conceive of the threat that was clearly approaching, implicit bias definitely is the major explanatory factor there, in that you are literally looking at something approaching that you are unable to compute and prepare for because it doesn't appear to be the threat that it is already explicitly said that it is. They were explicit as to what their intentions were for Ottawa. What was interesting to me too is we had the reciprocal failure of imagination or failure to conceive of threat amongst the protesters. It was incredible to me to watch protesters, thousands or hundreds of them outside Parliament, watching hundreds and hundreds of police officers assembling in riot gear to start addressing it, and literally looking at the repressive arm of the state and being unable to conceive that this thing was about to move on them. I mean, people were walking around with children with balloons and cotton candy like a fair. So it's the reciprocal, unable to recognize the thing that you are literally looking at, which has to do with exactly the types of biases that we're talking about. And amongst, in terms of people have been talking simply about white privilege, but having never experienced the repressive force of the state before in any meaningful sense, being unable to imagine it while you're staring right at it.
This is the same conversation we had after January 6th, right? Is that many of us who spend far too much time on Telegram to be healthy were basically like, January 6th is going to be a major event. It's going to be a major event. And then nothing happened and people stormed. And then these guys put up their feet on Pelosi's desks as if it was completely inconceivable to them that they're breaking the law, but that there might be some consequences. And I saw the same kind of privileged arrogance that on display in Ottawa and in Windsor especially as well, is like how can the arm of the state be pointed at us, right? How is this possible? And it was just inconceivable that they could possibly be breaking the law because they're patriots, they're fighting for the rest of us, and so on. And yeah, I don't know how you kind of lift those blinders. Hopefully they're on the way to being lifted now,
But then it's also taken, right? It's also interpreted as yet another illustration of the oppressive state, right? The tyrannical state, and voiding our freedom of expression by making us go home after 3 weeks. Josh, I wonder what the response of law enforcement was in Australia to some of the events that you've described.
Yeah, quite interesting because Australian authorities love a good fight when it comes to protests, irrespective of the leaning. Heavy-handed, in particular, at the those 3 stages of protest I've talked about. Really, whilst I'm cognizant of this, of the issues of bias and so on, really came out. The riot squad came out. There was horses in the streets pushing people out of the streets. Very low political tolerance for the protests, particularly in the midst of the public health crisis, but also very low broader, I suppose, police sympathy for the protesters. There was a lot of herding them in and attempting to arrest and mass arrests and protest and so on. So I think for me, what I saw, if anything, were the odd police who would resign because they're saying, I'm not going to get vaccinated and so on. But really across the board, there's been a low tolerance for the protests as a whole. Now, compare that to when the far right are protesting, there actually seems to be a little bit more of a laxedness to the approach. We've got images at times of the police high-fiving protesters that have caused public controversy, or protesters getting in and posing with police. And so that's a bigger issue. But the actual freedom protests have received very little in that way of laxedness. So yeah, quite interesting.
Yeah, I recall seeing, it was just a sidebar, I think in the Toronto Star a week or so ago, about how other countries were responding to similar convoys, so those copycats. And we were the outlier in terms of, that sort of hands-off approach. I mean, other folks, not that you wouldn't necessarily want this, right? But, in so many other countries, there's a very forceful response from the outset. No waiting around and letting things develop. So interesting Canadian approach, right? Polite hands-off approach in that context. Okay, I said I wasn't going to ask many questions, but I'm going to ask one just because, Josh, you used the word at the very end there, and that is the word freedom, and how that term has been used. And I think, tie that up. When a journalist asked me yesterday, what's your reaction to the way that the flag, Canadian flag, has been used in this context? So I'd like to get your perceptions on that. And I think this is for everyone, because similar language has been used in the US, Australia, really all the protests that we've seen in the last year or so, in this sort of context. So what are your perceptions of the use and abuse of that notion of freedom by folks involved in the movement?
Yeah, it ties into a broader public discourse over here over the last decade in particular about concepts of freedom of speech and so on. Australia doesn't have freedom of speech protected in our constitution, for example. It really does borrow heavily and lean heavily on the US conception of freedom and this idea of tyranny. Again, language that wasn't in the Australian context even 5 years ago. So we've seen this big import of US framing and libertarian discourse in particular about freedom from the state, having to fight tyranny and being about freedom. We've seen the freedom movement attempt to cloak themselves in legitimacy. So, for example, protesting at the Shrine of Remembrance, which is, really for us a really important site for our, contribution to World War I and World War II and other wars, and really that was heavily critiqued. But this framing themselves as freedom fighters again belies the fact that they're imposing. It's a really small minority of people imposing their views on everyone else. We've got some of the highest vaccination rates in the world. In Victoria, my state, we've got 95% approximately of people vaccinated. In Canberra, where the Canberra Convoy was held, 99% of people are double vaccinated. And so it's this imposition of their freedom over the freedom of the majority in many respects, which ties into their broader vocabulary and symbology of what they're fighting and so on. So I'm not sure what the parallels are with the Canadian context in that way that freedom has been framed. But to me, a lot of it owes directly to the US influence that really has emerged over the last five years post-Trump.
Yeah, Amar, I see you sort of jumping at the bit there. So
yeah, no, I mean, I think that this part and parcel of right-wing populism and the mainstreaming of populist rhetoric, right, is this us versus them, elite versus the people, good versus evil rhetoric, which I think we're seeing more and more of. For them, they will always be the small vanguard of freedom fighters attempting to wake up the sleeping masses, from the kind of slumber that they're in, that the elite, the evil, sinister elite are pulling the wool over their eyes, they're hiding the truth and so on. And so it's rhetoric that we've seen before. And it's the kind of us versus them framing is part and parcel of that, of these kinds of movements. The challenge, of course, is how to, I see a question in the Q&A about how to actually talk to them, how to address them. That's the challenge, is because once some of these very minor, I shouldn't say minor, but rational policy differences actually become elevated into cosmic struggles between good and evil, there is a potential for violence, and there is a potential that you can't actually have conversations anymore, right? It's no longer just me and you disagreeing on the mandates, which, you know, can be done reasonably. But once you get into, oh, it's the sinister Jewish elite who are actually behind the mandates, or Bill Gates who's trying to poison you, or whatever, or the kind of the save our children rhetoric that was very much part of the convoys as well, you're getting into different landscapes, right? And it's very hard to have policy debates with people who are drawing on evidentiary arguments that are kind of, you know, at best not provable. And so I think that's the challenge going forward, is we've upped the temperature of all of our policy conversations and political debates to cosmic levels, right? We've now how quickly the mask was politicized and became an us versus them issue, a liberal versus conservative issue, was astounding to me in March of 2020, right? How quickly we turned on each other over these basic things. And so I think our politics, the temperature of our politics is shifting quite drastically, and that resulted in the convoy, that resulted in January 6th, that resulted in the myriad kind of anti-lockdown protests and assassination threats against doctors and people providing vaccines that we saw over the last little while as well. And so everything is now up here, right? Everything is now very, very kind of high temperature, and the challenge, I think, going forward is how to kind of get our politics back to regular politics.
I can jump in for 1 second just to say one last thing about this whole concept of freedom kind of being co-opted and weaponized by the far right. There's certainly within anti-vaccine movements, which have historically a lot of crossover with populist movements and far right movements, there is a tendency to try to co-opt symbolism and terminology from the civil rights movement and other well-known historic movements. There are a variety of reasons for doing that. One of them is to sort of give the movement some credibility and legitimacy, and kind of portray it as this righteous, something that is kind of hard to argue against. That freedom is kind of a hard concept to argue against. We sort of all know that's not, they're not referring to the same freedom that a lot of us would think about, but it's also, in terms of a rhetorical strategy, it's quite effective, because it is, like when the Globe and Mail published an article about this, they got a ton of pushback, and people online just kind of going crazy at the idea, that they thought freedom was a bad thing. And so, you can see sort of how in that response to that article, you can sort of see the effective rhetorical strategy that it is. And I think, that certainly plays a big role in this too.
Yeah, it is a challenging one. I had done an interview around this very question, and I don't think I've ever had so much hate mail as I got in responding to that. And I think one of the greatest statements in this context came from an Indigenous leader who said something to the effect of, if the exercise of your freedom means that you are restricting the freedom of so many others, then that's not freedom, that's privilege. And I thought that was in this particular context a very powerful statement.
Just relating what we were saying here, also some of the questions that I'm looking at in the feed. I think that there's an important role for the courts in the public education and cooling of discourse around these debates. Whenever you look at the most divisive issues of major sort of seismic issues, whether we're talking about the civil rights movement in the United States, abortion debate, in North America generally, the courts have had a huge role in sifting through essentially emotional arguments and circulating rational arguments that subsequently didn't become exclusive, but definitely had a lot more weight in society. And I think that the policing of protest issues of freedom, they're going to be dealt with in the Canadian courts to a huge degree in the next 2 to 3 years, which will probably be, if not determinative, certainly helpful. I mean, some people will never have any awareness of what the courts decide, obviously, but it can't hurt.
That's actually a good segue. I'm not necessarily taking the questions in order, but it's related to one of the questions in the chat. Where'd it go? From the coverage, we realized the level of civic history, political, and even common knowledge of the participants was low and or wrong. Can we say that could be one of the root problems of gullibility and easy manipulation of populations by misinformation? Are there studies, plans, programs to thwart or avoid this with education in schools, universities, community centers? And I think that's absolutely right, that there was such a, I mean, people were talking about, in the Canadian context, talking about First Amendment rights. And, you know, we've heard it with, you know, Second Amendment rights as well in other contexts. So, you know, that CSI, I think, has a lot to answer for here. But I think there is, you know, sort of a basic gap in our civic knowledge, and so yeah, I'd like to hear you speak to that, as where we've gone wrong and how we can correct that.
I'll jump in, speaking broadly, in that I agree to some extent that there's potentially a lower educational base amongst some of these individuals who are attracted to the movements. But I also think that you've got to place this in context of prolonged lockdowns. I know that these are international, where people have been effectively, look, I think that the sociology of emotion has a really important role here, because people have been locked down, feeling helpless, alienated, disenfranchised, and really are being exposed in their bedrooms, in their lounge rooms, through blanket social media to these narratives, to these freedom movement narratives, but also to you know, the various questioning of the vaccines and everything else. And people were looking for answers. And I think it's, we've got to be very careful in framing these people as idiots, or you know, people who are, you know, basically not very bright and gullible and susceptible. I think in many cases, people were looking and doing their own research. You hear that phrase pop up all the time. Well, I've done my research. Well, you know, they're looking for answers. It's the fact that they're not finding them that's the problem, rather than the fact that they're necessarily just gullible and susceptible. So I think, you know, the fact that these people are emotional, they're angry, they're anxious, they're looking for answers. We've got to understand that in context of the larger challenges that they've been facing.
I'll just add to that, which I think is hugely important, is the collapse of trust that we're talking about, right? That we're experiencing over the last little while. It's not so much as Josh, it's not so much, I mean, a lot like what Josh was saying, it's not so much that they're anti-information, anti-research, anti-knowledge. It's that they don't believe the traditional mechanisms by which the rest of us receive knowledge. They don't trust the media anymore. They don't trust doctors. They don't trust academics. They don't trust journalists. And so it's the kind of ivermectin phenomenon, right? It's I don't want to put anything that hasn't been researched properly into my body, but I'm perfectly fine with putting horse medicine into my body as long as I learn about it on Telegram, right? So I've learned to now become more trustful of what I see in these alternative media platforms as the true source of knowledge and true source of information, as opposed to what Fauci's telling me or what I'm learning from public health officials, because all of them are corrupted, all of them are part of the sinister elite, and they're clearly trying to trick me, clearly trying to abuse me in some form. So it's not so much that they're anti-knowledge, it's that they don't trust the traditional mechanisms by which the rest of us receive knowledge. And so in addition to turning down the temperature, we need to kind of build back up trust in social institutions somehow. I don't know how you do it, but that's fundamental for kind of the functioning democracy of any kind. And we're seeing a lot of these things go in the wrong direction.
Yeah, Carolyn, I'm going to turn it over to you on that question about, how do we intervene against the misinformation, disinformation, trust or no trust?
So first, I would echo, what both of our speakers just said about this really being more of an emotional, ideological, mistrust-related issue, as opposed to an information or knowledge deficit. There certainly is an element of that for some of this, and I think when I look at that element, I tend to focus on kind of the changes in our media ecosystem, and a lot of people have trouble distinguishing between what is what is a news article versus what is an opinion article, and just kind of basic things like that can have some spillover effect. But in general, most of the viral misinformation we see, and most of the effective misinformation is really appealing to emotions. It's appealing to identity, to biases, not so much seeking to fill a deficit. There's actually some interesting research, because I was kind of towards the beginning of the pandemic, right when the vaccine was coming out. There were a lot of people who had never really been exposed to the anti-vaccine movement before, and their initial response was to sort of assume that these people were misinformed, uninformed, or uneducated. But there's actually several studies that have looked at that very question, and there's no significant difference in education. And in terms of the misinformed, uninformed thing, it's exactly right that oftentimes people who hold, whether it's conspiratorial beliefs, whether it's anti-vaccine beliefs, they're often the ones who actually know quite a bit about the topic. It's just that they're seeking that information from sources who are presenting it in biased or skewed ways, and so they're getting an interpretation of that information that is leading them to a false conclusion. But a lot of them can rattle on, about ingredients and approvals, and much more so than the average person. In terms of, how we go about addressing this and how we go about dealing with the trust issue, I mean, that's, we could do a webinar on that every week for a while. But, I think one thing is kind of trying to address this. There's somewhat of an imbalance in communication around a lot of these issues, including, I tend to focus on vaccines because that's something that I do a lot of research on. But when we think about things like vaccines, the quote unquote good information, the correct information coming from the CDC and World Health Organization and the institutions that a lot of us trust, the way that's being communicated is often from an institution or a scientist or doctor to the public, one way, basically. I'm telling you this. Whereas misinformation is often, that communication is usually two-way. It's a discussion, it's kind of peer-to-peer, and it seems more trustworthy to a lot of people. It's coming from people who are willing to talk to them, who seem like them. And I think, part of our job, or at least if you're in my field, my job, is figuring out, how we can address that imbalance and start to talk to people in a way that, is more, that they're more receptive to, and that comes across to them as more, more genuine and more like a conversation, rather than just kind of being told what to do when maybe they're not, necessarily trusting in the person telling them those things. And that also, I'll add one more thing, that also includes, sort of meeting people where they are, literally and figuratively, including, having a larger presence on some of these social media platforms that a lot of our organizations and institutions really aren't on right now. So, going to where people are and where they're getting their information and making sure there's not only, sort of fringe or alternative sources available to them.
Can I just answer one of the, oh, I think Barb, you're muted.
Sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead, 'cause Amar has to leave soon, so I'm going to let him make his final statements here.
Yeah, I just wanted to address kind of Tina Fettner's question from earlier about is this the kind of, because I think that's an ongoing concern, is as more and more of these groups, we saw the Gadsden flag, we saw the 3%er flag, we saw Proud Boys there, we saw QAnon, we saw all these people kind of coalescing, much like in January 6th, in one place, right? They've all found a common cause, they all found a common thing to be angry at. And so there is a concern that our random 65-year-old grandmothers in Q t-shirts going to now be exposed to 3%er content and Proud Boys content, and is there kind of a threat of ongoing recruitment? I think there is an element of things that we should be afraid of on that front, because as this rhetoric, as these kind of ideologies are more mainstreamed, as they fuse with other quote unquote more legitimate social movements, there is a kind of worry that some of these ideas will be more mainstreamed, right? And we're seeing some of that already with mainstream kind of populist politicians in Canada, and as Josh mentioned, in Australia as well. That things that start on the fringes that aren't kind of overtly neo-Nazi do kind of trickle into the mainstream, and they and they become kind of fused with a person's individual identity, especially in moments of heightened passion and heightened emotion, much like a protest, right? And so these ideas will carry a lot further, especially as they're fused in these moments of kind of collective enthusiasm. So I just wanted to kind of address that, because I do think it's a kind of ongoing fear for many of us.
Thanks, Amar. I appreciate that. And I think maybe I'll ask Canner's question here, because I think it's actually connected with what you've just said there. So he says that the first right-wing populist trucker convoy was in Australia in 2011, called the Convoy of No Confidence, inspired by the American Tea Party. This was an AstroTurf event backed by some coal industry elites, conservative politicians, and Rupert Murdoch's News Corporation, which also owns Fox. In 2018, 2019, pre-COVID, the trucker protests of France's Gilets Jaunes and the Alberta launched United We Roll convoy and a Brazilian convoy echo the 2011 Australian convoy. Is the recent Freedom Convoy old wine in new bottles? Also, we've read much about the fringe and far-right organizers behind the convoy, Pat King, Tamara Leak, and James Bowder. But if this is an AstroTurf event, what mainstream interests may have played a role in organizing the organizers? Oil and gas industry front groups, Bannon's International Right-Wing Populist Training Network, and local fronts, People's Party of Canada. Do presenters have any new info or conjecture on the background of the convoy? So a lot of questions packed into to that, but the panelists have seen this up for a bit, so perhaps you have some thoughts on that. And maybe Josh, will start with you, as he's referencing the origin. It's nice that we weren't the ones to export it; you exported it originally.
Yeah, I mean, we could go back to trucker convoys and blockades decades in the Australian context. And trucks have always been used because they have a disproportionate impact. You only need, 50 trucks to block down a good chunk of a city. And truckers in Australia have protested using blockades over taxes, over payments and conditions. But correct as far as I know, on the populist front. I suppose I'll speak quickly to the convoy in the Australian context and its funding. We know that Clive Palmer, who's a coal billionaire, who's really seeking to influence the Australian political space as coal becomes less and less, politically palatable with global warming and so on. He has funded good chunks of food. He's hired accommodation halls. He's barbecues, as he calls it. He plays it down, but significant amounts of money are going into this. So certainly there is a dimension of vested interest behind these convoys. often cloaked in, in freedom. Look, I think he's a populist politician. I think he's using it as a tactic. I don't think he has any real belief other than gaining power to serve his own vested interests. So that's one example, but we know that the elite, we have a billionaire class in Australia whose wealth is vested purely from digging minerals out of the ground and exporting them. And so, again, they've played a really important role in shaping our far right, the mainstreaming of far right ideas and so on. So I'd hazard a guess in saying that's the case internationally, but I don't want to comment on the Canadian context, maybe local.
Thanks for that, Josh. Yeah, our speakers are slowly dwindling away, and I know, Caroline, that you have to leave. So I think we'll wrap it up there. But just absolutely amazing. I really appreciate your initial presentations, but also your very thoughtful responses to the questions, and thank the attendees as well for the questions. Some really great food for thought there. And we will certainly be unpacking this. I've said several times, I'm desperate to write a paper about this, but I don't even know where to start. There are just so many pieces to pick away at. It's like, the end of the Thanksgiving turkey, and just don't know, what to eat first here. So yeah, it has been just a remarkable panel, and I'm sure that some of us will come together again to have more conversations about this as time wears on, and we learn more about, in particular, the police response. So thank you, everyone, and watch this space for more. We are always coming up with something at the center to share with you. So again, thanks so much for your time, energy, and engagement. And I wish everyone a good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. So take care, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye, everyone.